We are now in day 43 of Israel's war on Gaza. And I have to confess that for myself, as someone who's followed this conflict for 2 decades now, I didn't really see coming. I don't think most people saw or could conceive that there would be this much death and destruction before our very eyes as a response to the Hamas attack. October 7th is where this started in terms of the current war, right? October 7th, 2023, Hamas makes a surprise attack into northern Israel. 1,200 Israelis die. I believe some of those actually were not Israelis. There were some foreign workers, I believe, and over 200 hostages. But where we're at now is the people of Gaza have a death toll that's believed to be over 12,000. Over 12,000 dead, killed since October 7th. And over 4,000 children. World Health Organization, according to The Guardian, a week ago stated that a child is killed every 10 minutes by Israel. And we don't actually need to study all of this and refer to any news source. We're watching this with our own eyes. You can watch it on Al Jazeera, but you could also watch it on CNN and MSNBC. We're seeing children getting pulled through rubble. And we're also seeing Israeli politicians making comments such as wishing to drop nuclear bombs on Gaza. He was removed from his post for saying that, one of the Israeli politicians. But then Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel's response was basically, well, we don't do things like that. Well, we're seeing many comments that you can look up from Israeli politicians treating the entire civilian population of Gaza as if they were all Hamas. Hamas is the political organization that is accused of committing the crimes and leading that that happened on October 7th, the attacks on Israel. And this equating of the civilian population with Hamas is, I think, the root of the problem. But I will not focus on that for now. It's also noteworthy that Netanyahu just recently said that Israel is not, quote unquote, successful at minimizing Gazan casualties, but he ultimately blames Hamas. Hamas is who gets blamed for this. And Alan Dershowitz, a political commentator, a lawyer who has a very long legacy in his own right on many topics and a set of events, he just published on November 15th an article in The Hill. Says Hamas is murdering Palestinian babies in Gaza hospitals. What he's trying to say is all of the deaths happening of these children coming from the Israeli military, we can blame on Hamas because Hamas are the ones that have these hidden tunnels and that there's these weapons that they bring into hospitals. And this is all not... the evidence that Israel is putting out is about as strong as the evidence that the United States had for trying to prove there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The majority now are seeing this as just an excuse. We are seeing the total war, demolition of Gaza before our eyes, and we're supposed to accept it, and the U.S. government is leading it. And yes, I also must say this. For those who say, why don't you care about what's happening in Sudan? You didn't care about this, you didn't care about that. This is a very grotesque deflection. The United States government has made itself very clearly a player, one of the main player to allow this. Israel would not be able to get away with doing this without the approval of the U.S. government. That is not debatable. The U.S. government is giving billions of dollars a year already, and now even more weapons to allow Israel to do this. This is a U.S.-Israel war on Gaza. And let us also make sure we don't forget, Hamas is not the state of Gaza. They are not the government in the sense of actually a nation state. Gaza is a small area, 25 miles long, 5 miles wide, over 2.2 million people, that is governed loosely by an entity that has the most control of what is deemed an open-air prison that one Israeli back in 2003, I believe, Baruch Kimmerling, called the world's largest concentration camp. That's what Gaza is. And Israel's had control of its airspace prior to this. That border that Hamas crossed is the only real border that Israel's had to put its money and time in to worry about since they've been having the siege on Gaza. So, and in any case, we have a right to care and obsess over this issue because also our politicians, Bernie Sanders, who so many of us took hope in as being an alternative to the business as usual in America and American politics, he will not call for a ceasefire. He will not condemn the actions of Israel itself. And so Bernie Sanders now is basically complicit with the war crimes that the U.S. and Israel is doing. Tulsi Gabbard has been popular with many, even on the right, for her more or less isolationist positions and idea of the United States not getting involved in more foreign wars, but she is all behind Israel. Israel can go ahead and do whatever it wants. Sure, it's fine. Over 12,000 people killed as a response to 1,200 dead on October 7. And so what we basically have is a total political establishment where no one who's going to get elected as a U.S. president is going to be anything other than pro-Israel at this point, including Trump. He's made that very clear as well. So this is why this is going to be so important for us in the United States. Now, I am doing a presentation on the origins of Zionism. Zionism is the political ideology that actually helped create the state of Israel. And so I actually want to talk about this because the conflict did not start at October 7. Now, for many people, they think that the conflict goes back to biblical days, thousands of years ago. This must be eradicated from our minds. This is not a conflict that goes back to biblical times. Its origins can be found in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, it starts with a political ideology that I would argue that I would understand why it came into being in the sense that one could argue it had a very good intention for the Jews of Europe. It's a political ideology that starts in the 19th century with the idea of Jews having their own state. So let me talk about this ideology, its definition. I'm going to cover some points on this, and I'm going to make several videos going over the topic of Zionism and why I think it's also relevant in terms of thinking about why the conflict is happening the way it is now. So some people will say, oh, you shouldn't focus on the past. That's true if certain things are done and gone and we have something to move on with. We have to keep in mind that Israel has never defined its borders. So what Israel is not clear. According to the current Israeli government, most of the parties that Netanyahu has, Gaza is actually Israel and the West Bank and more. So where do they get these ideas that they have a right to all these places and that that's their land? It is rooted in Zionism. So Zionism is an unfinished project, despite what some people say, and this is very easy to demonstrate, and this is what I want to talk about. And I think that clarifying these terms and looking at this history will help us understand maybe a little bit more about what the political framework and the vision of the people in power in Israel have, and why we should not think of what's happening now anything other than ethnic cleansing and attempts to create greater Israel. That is what's happening. Now, so let's again go to Zionism. Zionism is a nationalist, a Jewish nationalist movement to establish a Jewish state. And there was some debate about where it would be, but ultimately Palestine was the location that was going to be picked. Now, why Palestine? Keep in mind that in the 19th century, when there were Jewish thinkers trying to think about starting a Jewish state, the majority of people in Palestine were Arab. It was not a state or its own country. It was a part of the Ottoman Empire, okay, ruled by the Turks. And the majority were Arab Muslim. There was also then a smaller group of Arab Christians. There were another group called the Druze, Druze, that are less known about, and they deserve another discussion and topic, especially in regards to their relationship to Israel and the Israel-Palestine conflict. But okay, so there's the Druze, a very small population of Samaritans, where we actually get the story of the Good Samaritan with Jesus in the New Testament Gospels. And yes, there were very small pockets of religious Jews that there's always been a small community there for the last several centuries. Now keep in mind, Israel does not become a state until 1948. So we're talking about a movement that starts in the 19th century, and we're talking about a movement that leads to creating a country in 1948. So these events have not been happening simply just since October 7th, but it's also not back to biblical days. We are talking about people in our that live with us now that have seen these events unfold, the major events leading to the creation of Israel. So going back to Zionism, I said earlier that I could sympathize with some of the reasons why this was coming into being. Zionism, so first of all, you will hear different debates about this. Some people will talk about a form of religious Zionism versus secular Zionism. And those who talk about the religious Zionism are basically saying the land of Palestine, which in the Bible is the land of Israel, has always been on the minds of the Jewish people because the Bible, the Tanakh, or the Torah, the Old Testament for Christians, it talks about God giving this land to the Jewish people. And Jerusalem is central to worship for Jewish people. So the argument is that Jews have always thought about, the land of Israel being a place that they should return to, because they were no longer the majority since the first century. But now let's think about this time frame here. We're talking about since the first century, the Roman conquest happened. There's a lot of history I'm going to skip over. What's important for us to realize right now is that Jews were once the majority in that area which is Palestine/Israel. And for 2,000 years, they end up not being the majority. And the land is conquered by Muslims and Christians, and then eventually becomes mainly a part of the Islamic world by the time we get to the 19th century. That's the important part to know. Now, I have some books because I also want to recommend some books that I think folks can look at to get a better grasp on this. This is called The Making of Modern Zionism, The Intellectual Origins of the Jewish State by Shlomo Avineri. He's still alive. He is an Israeli professor who is a Zionist, who claims to be a Zionist, and writes a very good history book on, and I will be using this a lot in these presentations, because he clarifies a lot of terms and histories and characters that we're going to go over that I think are important to understand in terms of the politics that currently exist in Israel now. So, returning to the question of religious Zionism. So remember, Modern political Zionism is a movement, an idea that Jews deserve to have a state because they are a minority and in a world full of people who have states, and they're going to go back to settle in Palestine. Now, what he says about in terms of the religion, take note of, this is Shlomo Avineri's points. He says, Jews might pray 3 times a day, this is on page 1, for the deliverance that would transform the world and transport them to Jerusalem, but they did not immigrate there. They could annually mourn the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av and leave a brick over their door panel bare as a reminder of the desolation of Zion, but they did not move there. And then he says, the belief in the return to Zion never disappeared, but the historical record shows that on the whole, Jews did not relate to the vision of the return in a more active way than most Christians viewed the second coming. As a symbol of belief, integration, and group identity, it was a powerful component of the value system. But as an activating element of historical praxis and changing reality throughout history, it was almost wholly quietistic. So what he's basically saying is, this wasn't a movement that, if Jews wanted to go back to Palestine, they could have. And this has been pointed out by another Israeli historian named Shlomo Zand. Many Jews were living in the Islamic world, and they were living in Cairo, they were living in Baghdad, and there was huge communities. And they were able to move freely to these areas. They could have moved to Palestine. They didn't choose. Palestine was symbolic of the area. It was a part of the spiritual framework that he's talking about. But there wasn't this idea of them going back and reclaiming the land. That was left to some vague messianic era in the way that Christians wait for the second coming of Jesus. But things changed. What created this idea of a political Zionism in which people were going to, actually create a state? And keep in mind, this is also very important, the first Zionists were not religious. Many were even atheists. So how does this really, how do we explain this? So in his introduction on page 9, he says, this dilemma of identity could not be solved by religious conversion. So let me explain. He talks about how Europe was changing from religious concerns into nationalist ones. And this is very important. That Jews were often persecuted in Europe because of their religion. They were Christ killers. This was a problem, okay, that they had to suffer through. Then as the religion starts to become less relevant, they had to deal with being minorities. If Germany is a place for Germans, then where does a Jewish person belong, even if they've been there for thousands of years, hundreds of years? Okay, can they really be a part of the nation? If we're talking about a time in the 19th century where Europeans were fantasizing themselves, imagining that they're going back to these founders from Gaul and ancient Germany, and that they're rooted in that. And here, Jews, and by further extension, we could say Roma people, other minorities, well, they don't belong into this. Okay, so this is the dilemma that they were facing. And by the way, this is to also go back to what I was saying. This is where I sympathize and understand why Zionism was coming into being from Jewish people, because in Europe, they were discovering, even if they don't remain religiously Jewish, even though it's really, there's always been a question, is it a religion or is it an ethnicity? Regardless, they were seen as somebody not from, they didn't belong to the land. They didn't fit into these nationalist narratives that were taking place all over Europe, okay? So, and so as Shlomo Avineri points out, he says, much of modern nationalism relates to origins and is suffused with cultural determinism and racism. It's a problem, right? That's the problem that nationalism has created. And so he then goes on to say, on page 11, talking about these political changes in Europe. He says, thus liberalism, talking about classic liberalism he's using, where we're freeing up markets and people and valuing individuals, and then yet we're also having this rise of nationalism. Okay, he says, created in these Jews the beginning of a new self-awareness, no longer determined by a religious terms, but coeval to the emergence of modern secular nationalism in Europe. Okay, and so then he also mentions, and regarding Zionism, it was, quote, I'm quoting him here, a response to the challenges of liberalism and nationalism, and much more than a response merely to anti-Semitism. Okay, this is important. So later when I cover Herzl, one of the founders, not in this video, but later on, and I talk more about him, and even the other Zionist thinkers, yes, anti-Semitism, let's not misunderstand what Avineri is saying. The anti-Semitism is a driving force, but what he's basically pointed out is Jews had long suffered under these ideas of being a minority that people didn't like. But this idea that every group of people deserve to have a state and that it should be ethnically pure or have this kind of cultural determinism, this is what's new. And that's the impetus in which you get Jewish thinkers who are also not religious that are going to call for creating a Jewish state. Now, one of the things that he doesn't really talk about here, which I'm going to cover thoroughly, and I'll be starting here in this presentation and drive this home even further in the next several videos, is the other ideology that comes with this is colonization, imperialism and colonialism. And with that, what that means is that native populations in a certain area are going to be seen as, well, they can be moved. They can be shoved aside. Land without a nation state with a flag on it is up for grabs, just like Africa. And that's the conversations that we see with early Zionists. They had the same European view. So part of what I want to draw attention to is that Jewish people were suffering truly, I think we cannot downplay this. In Europe, and there's a reason to say Europe different than the Islamic world in this, but in Europe, they were the only really religion allowed to exist, and they were outside of Christianity, and they were always being viewed as Christ killers, a conspiracy, and just treated terribly. So, but there was religious hatred towards them. And then again, as the priorities moved away from focusing just on religion, then it became the nationalist question. And what we see with the Zionists, instead of them saying, this idea that a minority that lives for centuries in a given country is not really a part of a nation state and not a part of that history, we should criticize that. They basically said, okay, we give up. We buy into that. So where does a Jewish person belong under this context? Everybody in the Christian world knows that Jews belong to the land of the Bible, whether you believe in the Bible or not. This is where Jews come from. It's in our rituals, as Avineri was talking about. So we're going to have to go back to Palestine. But Palestine was full of people. That is the this is the problem in the discussion. So I want to get to the heart of the critique. So let me actually just mention this last quote here from the Making of Modern Zionism, the Avineri, when he talks about Zionism and the State of Israel and how he defines it and what I'm going to be critiquing. He says, and this is in the preface to his 2017 edition, he says, the fact that there is a country which will welcome Jewish immigrants if they feel persecuted or uncomfortable in their country of residence vindicates the moral foundation and raison d'etre of Zionism and of Israel's law of return, which enables every Jewish person to immigrate to the country, Never again will Jewish persons persecuted or expelled find out that there is no place for them under the sun. Now, for those of us who are anti-racist and don't believe in the idea that it's right to persecute anybody based on any identity that they hold, there is absolutely no problem we have with understanding Zionism in this context, if we're talking about the mere fact of it being a safe haven for Jews. That's something that we need to make clear. But I am an anti-Zionist, and a lot of people are. And anti-Zionism is associated with being anti-Jewish for many people. And in this case here, if I said I'm anti-Zionist and you read this definition, it sounds like I'm against, this is the part I have a problem with. That's not the case. The problem for those of us who are critical of Zionism is that this discussion negates something that Edward Said talks about. He's a Palestinian writer. He wrote Orientalism. And I'm just showing this book. I'm not going to go through a long quote. The Question of Palestine. He's long passed away. He was a very well-known Palestinian commentator. And he basically talks about Zionism in his introduction. And he says, for Palestinian history, its traumatic national encounter with Zionism is unique to the region. Now, he talks about, from his perspective, a traumatic encounter with Zionism. Why? Because for Palestinians, where were they going to fit into this vision? How do we get to this place if we know that even by the early part of the 20th century, that Arabs were the majority of the population? How are we going to get Israel being created in 1948? There is going to have to be a displacement of the Arabs. And this is the critique that has been made against Zionism. And that's the problem. And I just want to point out again, so there's another book here. So just to show how this gets contentious. Anti-Zionism and Antisemitism in the Contemporary World by Robert S. Wistrich. I bought this book years ago. Let's see, it was published in 1990. And he would again, I want to mention here, I should just expand on this idea. He says, the fact that Zionism, rather than specific Israeli policies, generally bears the brunt of their antagonism, he's talking about someone like me, is at first sight puzzling and certainly not without significance. It is surprising to the extent that since 1948, the Zionist movement has scarcely played a decisive role in the formulation of Israeli policy, and its raison d'etre, there's that word used again, is by no means clear to many Israelis. On the other hand, opposition to Zionism as a political ideology may appear more easy to justify in terms of world opinion than openly declare intention to destroy a sovereign, independent nation-state recognized by the UN. The negation of Zionism has the further advantage of appearing to be theoretically distinct from hatred of Jews on racial or religious grounds, which since the Holocaust has been officially less than respectable in most countries of the world. So what he's saying is, first of all, Zionism doesn't even have any, no longer play. And I'll just say that my videos will demonstrate that that's absolutely false. And it's easy to disprove. And also what he's trying to say is, this is just a shield. It's a guise where everybody's just trying to, it's okay to criticize Zionism, but it's more dangerous to criticize Jews, and so that's what we're doing. Well, this is a lie. Many Jewish people have been denouncing Zionism or calling themselves post-Zionists, saying that, okay, the state of Israel needs to move beyond it and treat its citizens better, to not colonize any more of Palestine and oppress or occupy Palestinians. There's a lot that I have to say about it. I just want to point out that there is this ideological war that's going on there in regards to what it means to be a Zionist versus an anti-Zionist. I want to clarify from my position that is no means a critique of, it's a critique of a nationalist idea at the expense of Palestinians, as Said is talking about. And what we're seeing happen in Gaza now is a direct result of this ideology and the way that it has been talked about over the last century, and why I want to talk about it here and break this way. So I'm not going to take too much longer on this, but I want to point out again something very significant. In 2003, Alan Dershowitz, that same man who blames the deaths of babies that Israel is killing right now on Hamas, he wrote a book called The Case for Israel. And in this book, in 2003, he notes in his book that Israel, he says, it's intended to refute, in his introduction, that Israel is a colonial imperialist settler state comparable to apartheid South Africa, unquote. And that he also claims that it is absurd to accuse Zionists of being, quote, tools of European imperialism, unquote. And what he said is that Zionism was, quote, more of an immigration of refugees than a determined political or national movement, unquote. That's from page 14. Now keep in mind what we just read from Shlomo Avineri. That's a complete contradiction. He's already pointed out, no, it's a nationalist movement. And why I'm pointing this out is Alan Dershowitz he publishes a lot of articles. And what we're basically being told, by like people like Wistrich, that we are playing with the fires of anti-Semitism because we're accusing Israel of certain things and Zionism of things that it has no right to be compared to a colonial movement or imperialism, or talking about it being racism towards Palestinians. Well, I'm going to end this presentation on a primary source from a character that is the inspiration of the Israeli right, somebody that Netanyahu has much admiration and connections to in the history of his life, Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky. I will be covering him more in detail at a later time, but I want you to think about what I've been talking about. I want you to think about what you're seeing on your TV screen now. And let's look at this. So I want to recommend, if anybody would like to, if you look at Google, the Jewish Virtual Library. It's a great and informative Jewish internet library that just covers basically all topics Jewish and many interesting ways. They also have a section in there called Texts Concerning Zionism. So if you Google, write down Texts Concerning Zionism, you can see the primary source. But would we study communism and not read Karl Marx or Lenin? No. But I will tell you, the majority of people who are criticizing Zionism or supporting it don't actually refer back to these sources, and that needs to stop. And this is part of why I want to really address this more. I'm going to be covering this again, but I want to point out there's a text by Jabotinsky, Jabotinsky. He wrote this in November 4, 1923. It's called The Iron Wall. And I'm just going to read this one section here. And he says this: my readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. Notice the word colonization. He's saying, I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. He's talking about Jewish Zionist colonizers and their relationship to the Palestinians, Arabs that are there, okay? And he says, there is no such precedent. The native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage. And it made no difference whether the colonists behaved decently or not. The companions of Cortez and Pizarro, or, as some people will remind us, our own ancestors under Joshua ben Nun, that's the book of Joshua in the Bible, where the conquest of Canaan and the killing of the Canaanites to take over the land, that's what he's talking about, behaved like brigands. He even says that, they behaved like brigands. That's his. But the Pilgrim Fathers, the first real pioneers of North America, now he's talking about North America, were people of the highest morality who did not want to do harm to anyone, least of all to the Red Indians. And they honestly believed that there was room enough in the prairies both for the pale-faced and the redskin. Yet the native population fought with the same ferocity against the good colonists as against the bad. Every native population, civilized or not, regards its land as its national home, of which it is the sole master, and it wants to retain that mastery always. It will refuse to admit not only new masters, but even new partners or collaborators. And then he goes on to talk about the Arabs are not fools. So let's think about what he just said. Remember, he's the father of the right. Almost all of the Israeli politicians that are in power right now and leading this war on Gaza admire and follow the teachings of Jabotinsky. He said, what he basically argued is, we have to colonize the land and we know that they're not going to accept it. And he criticized Zionists that thought that there could be any collaboration or peace because he said it's only natural that they're not going to let themselves be colonized. So, who is the victim and who is the oppressor here? So just because we've learned about what happened to Jews in Europe, does that give them the right to participate in this colonization project in the way that Jabotinsky said? I will talk more about that. Of course, I'm going to introduce more. I'm going to go into the context of him and also how different Zionists had different visions. Keep in mind that there were some that were there were others that wanted to work more with the local Arab population. Whatever the case, Israel was created in 1948 and Palestinians were expelled to create space for that land. And all the wars that have been led up until now, Palestine has become smaller and there has been less land available to Palestinians. And just to point out that the Palestinian perspective on this does change the way that this gets looked at. In other words, there's two stories. And so I'm hoping that as this terrible massacre that we're watching keeps going, that the information I'm going to cover will help clarify why so many of us are standing up for Palestinians. We are against Zionism. We're not against Jewish people. And we're hoping to promote an ideology that at some point will create the ability for the people there to actually get along equal with each other and not have this terrible power imbalance that we saw basically argued in favor of by Jabotinsky.